Thanks for having class last week with Deidre. I know she really enjoyed it. Was glad to be able to come in and talk to you guys about papers. And she's really good about that, about trying to encourage people to get papers done and get their research and kind of think about that. So I was very glad to have her come in. What I want to do today, I want to keep talking just a little bit. I know this has been, like I told you, depressing. I want to keep talking a little bit about modernity and progressivism. I'd like us to get through it today so that we can start really diving into what the reaction, what Christian humanism is, as it confronts all of these problems of modernity. So last week when we were talking on Tuesday, if you guys remember, and it probably hard to not remember, but we were talking about all those statistics and what was happening in terms of the Soviet Union and China, Cambodia, places like Nazi Germany. And I wanted to make the point, and I hope this was fairly clear, that from a Christian humanist perspective, all ideology is a failure to understand human existence. It's in some way always a minimizing of what humanity is. It's a diminution of humanity. And so it's very easy from a Christian humanist perspective to lump together, for example, fascism and communism. They're mortal enemies. They hate each other, absolutely hate each other, but they're so identical in almost every way that I think it's really impossible for us to separate one from the other. And of course, the one thing that both the fascists and the communists have in common is that they're both socialists in some way. They believe in using the government to control the means of production. They believe that in some way they can liberate humanity by using the political process. And so in that way, even though we might say that Hitler and a Stalin despise each other, we recognize that they're really doing very, very similar things. Now, there is, of course, a form of democratic socialism, like we saw in the 1990s in Sweden, that doesn't have that kind of brutality, but certainly socialism writ large can be an extremely destructive force in society, and it's never worked at all in the 20th century. It hasn't worked economically, and it hasn't worked from a humane perspective either. But I want us to ask this question, and the two things I'd like to talk about today. I'd like to look at 19th century philosophy for a bit, and then I want to look to the idea of what we call progressivism and what progressivism means. So we've already spent a lot of time thinking about modernity. We've spent a lot of time thinking about ideology. But I think that we can only really understand how these things arise if we recognize what was going on in the main tenets of 19th century philosophy. And 19th century philosophy is deadly because it is the diminution of the human person. And so I want to just talk about a couple of the great figures of the 19th century. And when I say great, I don't mean good. I just mean important, that they're significant in some way. And we can really break down what they're doing into just a couple of categories. Probably the most important figure, and please know I'm not in any way attacking his level of intelligence. That would be ridiculous. The guy was brilliant. So I'm not attacking that, but I am attacking an aspect of what he did. So I think by far the most important thinker of the 19th century was Charles Darwin. Just an incredible figure in what he gets across in terms of understanding what's going on with evolution in particular and biology. What we have to recognize, and Darwin's a fascinating guy. He loses a daughter when he's a young father. He never really gets over this at all. I think something that we can all identify with, this kind of loss and tragedy that he's dealing with in his own life. But Darwin writes a couple of books, one in 1853 and another in 1859. And what he does with these books that he writes is he is really synthesizing, very much synthesizing the ideas that had been circulating for a while in terms of what was happening in biology. And so we often identify with Darwin the idea of evolution, but that's not quite fair to other thinkers. We can go back and find theories of evolution in Aristotle. And certainly in the modern world, the theory of evolution was really put forward by a Jesuit priest several centuries before Darwin did. So Darwin's very late in the game, coming to this idea of evolution. And what he really argues more than evolution is what we might call adaptation. That's really what he's doing here. And he's arguing that in essence, we're to understand the human person, that we recognize that if we were to think about mankind and what man is, or what the human species is at this point, it is a species that has encountered all kinds of problems environmentally and biologically throughout its history. And those humans that have been able to adapt to their environment succeed and pass their genes on to the next people who also know how to adapt to their environment. And those that aren't able to do that are just left out of the gene pool. Right? It's not language he would use, because we don't use gene language until the 20th century. But that's what he's getting at, that the population decreases in some way or increases in another way because people have successfully adapted to biological changes and to environmental changes. So you can imagine, and you think about it culturally, if we were to go right now and talk to an Inuit Indian around the Arctic or in northern Canada, they would have something like 70 separate words for snow. And we have maybe 3 or 4 different words for snow. And it makes sense because that when we think about what they're doing, this is their environment. They understand that in all kinds of ways. And that's the kind of thing that Darwin is arguing is happening at a biological level, not just at a cultural level. So the Inuit Indians are a people who've survived in the Arctic because they've learned how. They know how to adapt to nature, and they've made nature work for them in some way. Whereas there were probably other peoples at some point who encountered a similar kind of cold or tundra or Arctic, and they failed. And we don't remember them because they're gone, right? So that's where Darwin comes from. And it would be really hard to exaggerate how important he is, because his evolutionary thought, again, even though it's a synthesis of other ideas, it shapes everything in the 19th and the 20th centuries in every way. And I hope you guys realize too that you can start once you have Darwinian language, and I hate to blame Darwin for this because by all accounts he was a genuinely humane guy, but when you think about what you can do with Darwinian language, you can start making racist claims. That is, you can start arguing that certain humans have evolved differently than certain other humans, and that skin type is a way of recognizing what those differences are. And that would have been very hard. For example, and those of you who've had me in class before, I'll argue very strenuously that someone like John C. Calhoun, even though anti-black in 1820, was not racist in the way that he would be in 1850. And part of that is because he now has a new language that he can use in terms of talking about race. So he has the same views in 1820 and 1850, but he has a different vocabulary, and that vocabulary allows him to be a racist in 1850 in a way that in 1820 would have been very difficult to recognize. And that kind of idea of racism comes into American history in the 1830s and the 1840s full force. But here's what I want to note about Darwin right now. Remember, this is a diminution of the human person. And the reason it's a diminution is because Darwin says that the only thing that matters is that we're biological. That's what defines who and what we are as a people. And of course, he's not wrong about that. We are biological beings, there's no question about that. But are we merely biological? That becomes the question. Darwin would suggest that we are. The second person who is deeply influenced by Darwin and usually is regarded as the most important thinker of the 19th century. I'm going to make an argument why we shouldn't believe that, but usually is regarded as that because of the rise of the Soviet Union and of communist China in the 20th century, is Karl Marx. And Marx is a student indirectly, he didn't actually study under him, but he's a student of Friedrich Hegel. And the idea of progressivism, and I'll get to that in a little bit, not quite yet. But Marx takes the ideas of Darwin and he says, yeah, there is this evolutionary process, but it's not biological. And yet, like Darwin, it is material. And so with that, he and Darwin have almost everything in common in that they give material explanations. But for Marx, everything is reduced down to the idea that we are economic beings, and that everything we do is decided by the economic social structures that exist in society. So no spiritual creature there at all. Marx is actually, even though he's racially, ethnically Jewish, he is raised as an Episcopalian, as a member of the Church of England. So he's raised as a Christian, but rejects that, almost completely rejects that, but takes the ideas of Christianity, especially the idea of the afterlife, and presents that in his own theory. And so what Marx comes up with in his evolutionary theory, and he takes this from Aristotle as well as from Darwin, he calls it a dialectic. And in this dialectic, there are all these stages of history. And history, for all intents and purposes for Marx, history is God. God is history. There is no God. Instead, history is this process of revelation. And history reveals itself over generations. So whereas Darwin says we encounter the biological and we react in a certain way, Marx says because of these economic superstructures, we encounter history and we react in a certain way. And he gives us what he calls stages of history. And everything in history for Marx, and I think this is the most utterly bizarre vision possible, and why millions of people gave up their lives for this, I will never understand as long as I live. But Marx believed that the final stage of history was the stage of communism. And what communism meant, and I'm not exaggerating, this is his vision of heaven. It's heaven here on earth. So it's a Christian ideal that's made real in this world, not the next world. But his idea of heaven on earth is that each of us gets to choose our own labor day by day. So if I wake up this morning and I want to be a psychiatrist, I'm a psychiatrist. If I wake up tomorrow and I want to be a ditch digger, I'm a ditch digger. I'm not exaggerating. This is his vision of history, that we get to choose our own labor day by day. It's bizarre, utterly bizarre. But this is what people in the 20th century, by the millions, murdered for, this ideal that we could have this final stage of communism in which we're all equal, but we're equal by our labor. So notice again what Marx says. Much like Darwin telling us that when it comes down to it, we are at root biological. Marx says when it comes down to it, we are at root economic, and that everything we choose, still materialistic, but everything we choose is chosen because of our reaction to economic and social structures that exist emerging through history. The third person was really famous in the 19th century. We've almost totally forgotten him in the 20th century, in the 21st century. But he was the guy in the 19th century, especially if you were on a libertarian or free market side of things, on the conservative side of things. A guy by the name of Herbert Spencer, huge figure. And if we remember him at all, we remember him through a literary figure because he's the model for Sherlock Holmes. So that's it. Again, if we remember him through this literary figure. And if you've ever read any of the Sherlock Holmes stories, you know that this is a totally rational man who can solve any crime simply through rationality. And so not surprisingly, even though he's diametrically opposed to Marx, he is deeply influenced by Darwin. And so what he creates is an argument for social Darwinianism. And I'll give you an example here. And he's blatant about this. So I'm not exaggerating. This is how he puts it. He says, all of society, now remember, he's the opposite of Marx. Marx wants full government control of everything. Spencer wants no government control at all. He just wants a total laissez-faire field where everybody's competing. But this is what Spencer says. And he, by the way, he's the darling. He's brought over here by Andrew Carnegie, and he is given huge feasts all around America by the corporate wealthy in America. Here's what he says. It's utterly anti-Christian. But he says, if we were, for example, to encounter a homeless person, our desire, our goal would be to walk away from that person as quickly as possible and let nature deal with them. And so in that Darwinian sense, we want desperately for that homeless person to die. So there should never be charity. Charity is only a prevention of nature. Natural law, according to Spencer, will kill the homeless person. And that's good because it means then that we no longer have to deal with that homeless person, and that homeless person will not pass on their poverty or their sin to the next generation. So it's our way of getting rid of them. So you do not want charity, you do not want welfare, nothing like that at all, because all that does is distort the evolutionary process of society. So I hope you guys see he's the opposite of Marx, and yet he's almost identical to Marx in the way that they're both utterly materialist in what they're doing. And even though if I had to vote, I would vote for Spencer over Marx, I think they're both probably pretty evil in what they're getting at, and very much opposed to the kinds of things that we're talking about in this class overall. But that, those are your two extremes. They're both radically materialist. Hugh?
I was just going to say, does he have a kind of eschatology of sorts on Earth at all? And that would resemble Marx's?
He, not really. He does. He's an anarchist. And so he does believe ultimately in the withering away of the state. And so he sees history as a process by which we become more and more free, but we can only do that if we get rid of the alcoholics and the impoverished. They're people that we should not pity at all, but dismiss and let nature take care of. Now, this is the one positive part of what he says. If we walk away from a homeless person and that homeless person feels shame by that, and they then correct their life, then we absolutely want them in the gene pool. And so by us not helping them, we're actually helping them because we're shaming them in their poverty and inspiring them to get out of it in some way. But you would never, anyone you can think of, Dorothy Day or other people who are constantly helping the poor St. Francis, right? These are enemies of humanity, because they don't allow us to get rid of this riffraff. And so I hope you guys see, this is Darwin applied to social theory, right? And so again, we call it a kind of social Darwinism. and we want to get rid of these people as quickly as possible. Okay, does that make sense for everyone? So he is actually, interestingly enough, Spencer is raised in a Christian home, but like so many people, like Marx, he forsakes it in every way. So we don't have that at all. Okay, the scary thing though is how popular he is in America. That's, the fact that corporate heads are bringing him over to kind of give his speeches everywhere. It's really, really disturbing. But there it is. Okay, on the other side then, the fourth figure, who we're now getting still materialist, but just slightly less materialist than the first three. And we have to be careful with this guy, because there is a genius to him, but he's, well, I'll just put his name down. It's Sigmund Freud. Freud, I would argue, is the fourth most important thinker of the 19th century. And this is why I'm conflicted about him. Freud is the only one of these guys who keeps his faith. He remains Jewish. Never really renounces his Judaism. And so there's an element of religious faith in everything that he argues. In the 1940s, every man of the left would have loved Sigmund Freud. Now, and you'll see why here in a moment, the left despises him. He has been completely read out of the left, even though he would have always been considered a left-wing figure up until about 30 years ago. And again, you'll see why here in a moment. This is what Freud says. And like the other three thinkers, it's monocausal in his. So if for these guys it's evolution or economics or material conditions, Freud is a little bit more religious, but not much. He's still pretty materialistic. Here's Freud's argument. Freud says that, and it's more complicated than this. I'm just going to give you the bare bones version of it. I actually took a semester on Freud and Jung in college. It was pretty interesting stuff, but so I'm just giving you the bare bones here. So I'm not really doing him justice. But here's what Freud says. There's a moment that we are not conscious of, right? And it would be bad if we were conscious of it. We're not conscious of it. There's a moment where I, Brad, as a male, see my mother, and I recognize she is not me. And for the girls and the women in this class, you had the same thing happen with your father. There was a moment, you were probably 1.5 or 2, and it was not conscious. You just suddenly realized, I'm not like my father, I'm like my mother. And so this, for Freud, is totally healthy. This is what every human needs to do. We need absolutely to recognize what our sex is. And for Freud, there's really only male and female. And you can start seeing why this is going to be a problem for the modern left. And so Freud says all psychosis comes from the inability, and it's a mistake, when I'm 1.5 and I don't see my mother as different. It leads to perversions like homosexuality. And so for Freud, homosexuality is a perversion. It's not a good thing at all, which is why you can see the modern left doesn't like him. It's a crime against nature, and it's a failure. So how would I account for homosexuality? I would say, well, here's a male who didn't recognize that his mother was different. And so what do we do to correct it? We go into deep psychoanalysis, and we break down his relationship with his mother and father, and we keep digging deeper and deeper and deeper until the modern patient, 25, 45, age 50, whatever it may be, we break it down, and he is able to remember that unconscious decision he either made or failed to make as a child. That's why you always, if you're ever, and there's kind of a joke about it, but whenever you meet a Freudian, they always ask about your relations with your mother, because that's what determines everything for a male. For a woman, it would be the opposite with a man. So notice what Freud says here. Every one of us in this room is a psychosexual being. Again, not untrue. But not the whole of it. So notice what these guys have done, and this is where C.S. Lewis becomes so important. They have each taken one idea and they have exploded it to madness, right? That's what they've done. They've taken a proper truth, but they've exaggerated it and taken it out of its context. So of course we are material beings, right? If I slap myself, it's pretty clear, right? And that actually kind of hurt, and I meant to, right? I'm a physical being. I'm a biological being, right? I've got 7 kids. I'm a psychological, sexual being. There's no question about that. When I go to the grocery store, I compare prices of bread and quality of bread. I'm an economic being. But what we notice about us, and this is where I think the Christian humanist is so important, or just the humanist overall, we are mysteries even to ourselves. So of course I'm sexual, of course I'm psychological, of course I'm biological, of course I'm economic, but I'm also a billion other things that complicate who I am. And there's this great moment in C.S. Lewis's novel, That Hideous Strength, where a secondary character makes this statement. He says, "It is always impossible to study man. You can only get to know him." And that for me has been my guiding principle in all of my scholarship, in everything I've done. You can never study man. You can only get to know him. And I think that's just critical. And it really, if you guys were going to ask me, give me the elevator pitch. We've got 2 minutes on the elevator to get to floor 48. What would you say this class is about? I would say it's that. It comes down to this idea that we cannot study man. We can only get to know him. So that's the essence of what we're trying to do here. Okay, so again, notice what I'm doing with these guys. I'm not arguing they're wrong. I think they're wrong, but I'm not arguing they're wrong. And I'm not arguing they're not intelligent. They're incredibly intelligent people. But the problem is they dismiss it. And just take a complicated figure like Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, who's not a formal philosopher, unlike these guys who are trained in philosophy, all of them. And Freud, by the way, was incredibly good at the liberal arts and the great books. He's liberally educated. So even though he brings science into it, he's very, very liberally educated. Marx is liberally educated as well. So these are all guys who are very Western. But think about a complicated figure like Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson tells us all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's it. That's Jefferson's definition of the human person. And notice what he does. Jefferson basically says, I've now defined Maria. Maria, go make your life for yourself. Right? That's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. I have not limited Maria. I have given a starting point, and from that starting point, she will in community thrive. That's totally different than what Darwin and Marx and Freud and Spencer are doing. They are limiting our definition of the human person, not expanding it. And so that's why we can say someone like Thomas Jefferson, who's not a philosopher, gets humanity right because he doesn't limit who and what we are. He allows us to flourish. And that's the brilliance of this. But there's a fifth figure when we're talking about the 19th century. And by the way, Freud's a little complicated for us as Americans because he's an Austrian. He's from Vienna. And he writes almost all of his great books in the 1880s and 1890s, so we call him a 19th century figure, but he's not translated into English until 1902. So from an English-speaking perspective, we often think of him as a 20th century figure, but he really is a 19th century figure because of what he's doing with his great work. Okay, final person. We're going to spend a lot more time on this person than any one of those guys. The final person, I would argue, is by far the most important of these five. So much so that I will say this. I think 500 years from now, when someone is discovering our century, or the last 2 centuries and writing about it, or the last 3 centuries and writing about it, I'm guessing Marx will be a footnote. I don't think he'll be central, but I think the 5th figure will have books upon books written about him. And this is Friedrich Nietzsche. I think Nietzsche is the most important figure of the 19th century, and he is adamantly a 19th century figure. He is born in 1844, and he dies, crazily enough, in 1900. Right? He's just perfectly 19th century in what he's doing. He is born into a German family living in Eastern Europe. His father, and I think this is critical to understand him, his father is a devout Lutheran minister. He's a pastor. And at age 12, Friedrich Nietzsche just rebels against his father in every way and wholeheartedly rejects his father and rejects his father's religion. And yet, and I want to be a little careful about this because I don't want to insult anyone at all. I do think, and I think it'll be clear that when we read this, that there is, if we ever had to identify if we ever had to identify Nietzsche with any religion, there would still be a Lutheran element to it. And I'll try and explain what I mean by that. Okay, so here's Nietzsche. Nietzsche is fascinating for a lot of reasons. First of all, he is utterly brilliant in every way. Nietzsche is incredible in his intelligence. I would put him up against any of those guys up there any moment, and he could hold his own in every argument. He has probably read all of those guys inside and out. He knows what their arguments are. He can take them apart. Here's the other great thing about Nietzsche. Nietzsche was the best writer of the 19th century. Of any academic, nobody wrote like Nietzsche. He had an incredible pen. And that's really dangerous. If you've ever picked up Marx, Marx is a dreadful, dreadful writer. Nobody picks up Marx for his prose. It's horrible. Nietzsche is exactly the opposite. And that's terrible because it means we can understand Nietzsche. And it means he's very seductive because he is such an incredible writer. And you'll see that even when what I read here in translation. The guy is just brilliant. Here's what I'll say about Nietzsche, and I'm telling you guys this on a very personal level. Me, Brad, I love reading Nietzsche. I will, when I'm in the mood, I will pick him off the shelf and I will read anything from him and I will be delighted. But at the end of that, I always have to take a shower and I always feel like I need to go to confession. It's not a healthy thing to read Nietzsche. He is very dark. And I would say that this is a guy who, even more than Marx, I mean, Marx is just flat out evil, but it's a boring evil. Nietzsche is a seductive evil. He's like a vampire. There's something brilliant about him that you want to get into his evil and figure it out. Nietzsche is one of these guys who stared into the abyss, and I'm not sure he ever came out of it. I think he really looked into the devil's face and he got a glance back. And I think it affected him deeply, really, really deeply. And you'll see that when you read Nietzsche. There's just, it's like playing with AI. It's really fascinating. You want to keep digging deeper and deeper, and then suddenly you realize, I've been speaking to demons for the last half hour. That's what reading Nietzsche is like. And what's different about Nietzsche than the other guys here, and why I think he matters so much, is he is not anti-spiritual. He believes very, very strongly in the spiritual world. I think his spiritual world is dark, but he believes in the spiritual world. So he is not a materialist at all, like Marx or Darwin. He believes wholeheartedly that there is a life of the spirit, but it's a strange one. Okay, Here's what I want to say about Nietzsche before I get into his arguments, just to give you a kind of personal idea of how this guy is. We don't know when, but Nietzsche caught syphilis at a young age. And syphilis, sexually transmitted disease. He catches this. Now, of course, if you get it, we have antibiotics and we can take care of it. In the 19th century, there was absolutely no way to take care of syphilis. And what it does, and it was always regarded as an upper class disease, because that's what the upper classes are doing with each other. They're immoral. And so they're spreading syphilis. And Nietzsche catches it. And what it does is it eats away at his brain. That's what syphilis does. It attacks the brain. And so you never really know in Nietzsche's writing when he is in fits of madness and when he's lucid. You just have no idea. And part of it is because he is such a brilliant writer, and you just get sucked into his writing, even though he could have been totally crazy when he's writing what he's writing. So I'll just give you, this is what he says about himself. He tells us in his writings, he says that his writings collectively are the fifth gospel. He does not mean that symbolically. He means that he is as great as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Friedrich is number 5. He's giving us a new Christian gospel, kind of like the Mormons with the Book of Mormon, right? That they've got this whole new book. Nietzsche further says, and he believes this, that he is the equivalent of Christ. He is the Holy Spirit made manifest. So he believes he's the third person of the Trinity put in human form. You guys, you're with me, right? That's crazy. That's not normal. You don't listen to people who say things like this, right? So that's Nietzsche in all of this. But Nietzsche, in his less crazy moments, would say things like, my writings are the greatest gifts ever to humanity. So even when he wasn't declaring himself God, he was writing at a very arrogant level. So do you guys see why I feel like I need to take a shower and go to confession after reading him? This is creepy, creepy stuff. And if Nietzsche was possessed with several demons, I would not be surprised by that. He's still more interesting than Marx. But, again, Marx's evil is just banal. It's boring. Nietzsche's is exciting. It's Hollywood. It's great stuff. It's like if you guys have ever seen the movie or read the comic book Constantine. It's that kind of thing, right? Where the devil is flashy. He's interesting. He's not boring. And we see that with Nietzsche. Okay, here's Nietzsche's main argument. I'm going to read to you his anti-Christianity, but I want to give you his main argument because, again, it's very different than what we've seen in these other thinkers, probably closer to Spencer than it is to Marx. And Nietzsche is often regarded as a right-wing figure, not a left-wing figure. And part of that is because Hitler was obsessed with Nietzsche. And especially, and the great, and you guys, if you ever, incredible, absolutely incredible. I may put this in the Dropbox for you guys. But the greatest expression of Nietzschean philosophy is in a 16-hour opera by Richard Wagner called The Ring. And my wife and I, back in 2005, Maria, you were what? You were 2 when we went. We got invited. It was one of the coolest experiences of my life. But the Seattle Opera put on the entire Ring, all 16 hours. It was 4 nights. We had 4 hours a night. And it was just glorious. And I mean, it's evil, but it was just incredible watching the Ring. It was beautiful. Some of the best production values I've ever seen, just sitting night through night. It's like if you could imagine the Lord of the Rings written by Satan, that's what The Ring is, right? It's just, again, flashy, evil, but amazing. And Wagner loved Nietzsche. In fact, there were always rumors that they had a thing for each other. I don't think that's probably true. I think Nietzsche was pretty straight, but there was always that rumor. And there was also a third figure involved, Mad Ludwig of Bavaria, and who knows what went on with all of these guys. But regardless, Wagner in his music is living up very much to what Nietzsche was trying to do. But here's what Nietzsche argues. This is the essence of everything he argues. Nietzsche argues for a radical, absolutely radical individualism. That's what he wants. And so he describes this. He says that his goal is to create the Übermensch, which we often translate into English as Superman, which is why Hitler liked him. Mussolini liked him too. Lenin and Stalin liked him too. But he said that we would have this kind of Superman, or what we might literally translate from German, Übermensch, would actually be translated as the overman, the superior man in some way. And so the argument Nietzsche makes is that all of society is trying to produce the Überman, the Overmensch, the Übermensch. And what that means for Nietzsche is not, you think about the kind of nice individualism of Thomas Jefferson. I'm an individual, you're an individual, we love each other, we get along, we form community, right? It's de Tocqueville's individualism. It's Henry David Thoreau's individualism. It would be the individualism of Simon and Garfunkel in the 20th century. It's nice. That's not what Nietzsche means by it. Nietzsche means that the true individual is one who has totally escaped the clutches of the Greco-Roman Judeo-Christian inheritance. That is, the true individual is the one who has escaped good and evil. Good and evil are mere categories for the Übermensch. The Übermensch is concerned with domination. And this is why Nietzsche's followers, Nietzsche himself is not anti-Semitic. Well, he's as anti-Jewish as he is anti-Christian. He hates religion. But the reason he hates it, what does Judaism teach me? Well, it teaches me that there is a God and there is no God before him. It teaches me that I should honor my mother and father. In other words, what does Judaism teach me? It restrains me. It puts shackles on me. And that's what Nietzsche rejects. And so tradition, inheritance, mom and dad, God, these are terrible things because they lessen us. So if I were to take Nathaniel and make him the Übermensch, Nathaniel would rule over all of us. It wouldn't be, let's all be individuals and get along. It would be, how can I dominate the other people in this room? That's what the Übermensch does. The Übermensch is superior to any one of us. And I'll never forget, I'm sure some of you guys have read the Harry Potter stories. You remember right at the end of the first Harry Potter story, where Dumbledore is talking to Harry, and he's explaining Voldemort. And he says Voldemort is beyond good and evil. It's a total Nietzschean moment. Voldemort is the Übermensch, right? And of course, think about what he does. He has to split his soul. It's crazy. But Rowling is clearly playing with Nietzschean philosophy there, doing it at a very basic level, but she is playing with it. And that's what Nietzsche is saying. And so that's why, and you guys can disagree with me, but look at the 20th century. Look at a Hitler. Look at a Mussolini. Look at a Stalin. Look at a Lenin. Look at a Castro. Look at a Pol Pot. Look at an Idi Amin. What do they all have in common? They all believe they were Übermensch. They all believe that. They all believe they were superior to every other individual. And so the 20th century, in a really weird way, was not just a struggle against ideology. It was a struggle against these Nietzschean figures. And I think that's what holds together a Hitler and a Lenin. They both believe they're beyond good and evil. They have, and think about, what did C.S. Lewis say about them? Once they are beyond good and evil, they're no longer men. They've divorced themselves from humanity. And of course, Lewis never mentions Nietzsche, but it's clear that Nietzsche is in the back of his mind. So do you guys see my argument? You don't have to agree with me, but this is why, again, I think 500 years from now, Nietzsche will be studied in a way that Marx will be a footnote. Marx will be something subordinate to Nietzsche, but Nietzsche will be the main focus of the study. And Nietzsche himself, right, he's not a bad guy. He's a really interesting guy. Doesn't treat people terribly, but his philosophy tends towards this kind of evil. And I really do think, I mean, for what it's worth, I think there's a demonism in it, in what he's doing and what he's getting across. Yeah, please.
I don't disagree with you at all, but if he claims to be outside of good and evil, and we come at it looking at from a Judeo-Christian Greco-Roman perspective, can we really say that he's still evil then? Because we're applying to him a system he doesn't believe.
Yeah, well, I would argue, and we could go back and forth about this, I would argue that the understanding of good and evil is absolute. There is no escape from it. So to pretend to escape is really just an excuse to do evil. It's not an excuse to do good, because no one who's good would claim that. Only someone who was evil would claim to escape beyond it. But that's where, and I want to say, okay, so this is a great question, and I'm not in any way dismissing you, and I hope we keep talking about this. But this is where I think it's really important that we think about politics not as left and right, but as man and anti-man, right? It's a vertical, not a horizontal way of thinking. So, and this is where, so how many of you guys, I know you all read Abolition of Man, and I think I asked you this, how many of you have read That Hideous Strength? Okay, good. I mean, think about That Hideous Strength. It is clearly you are either man or you're anti-man. And the same thing with Paralandra, right? You're either man or you're the unman. And that's, I think Nietzsche is creating a category in which we go beyond humanity. But I'm not sure that's possible. I'm not sure that's anything but an excuse to do ill. And I don't think that's what Nietzsche means by it, but I think that's those who follow Nietzsche. I think that's what they're doing. So, you have a follow-up or anybody else? Because I want to make sure, again, you guys don't have to agree with me, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page of argumentation. So, okay, well, let me read. Yeah, please.
Do you know how old off the top of your head Nietzsche was when he got syphilis?
I don't. No, I'm not sure how old. I just know he was young. And
like under 20?
I would guess he was about your age when it happened, but I need to go back and look. So I'm pretty sure this was a liaison he had, and I don't remember if it was with a prostitute or I can't remember, but he definitely caught it, and it just ate away at him. And that's the thing with syphilis. You can go years and be totally fine, and then it'll hit you, and you're out for months.
He did eventually have a breakdown too, right?
Yeah, he died of it. So, yeah, it's a tragic story, definitely. A very tragic story. And, he's 56, right? He's 2 years younger than I am when he dies. So I would call that pretty young. It would have been interesting to see what he would have said about the 20th century had he lived into it. Okay, so let me read just a little bit from Beyond Good and Evil. And you'll get a sense here of not only how intelligent Nietzsche is, but you'll get a sense of how brutal he was too, and why this is such seductive writing overall. So did I send this to you guys, this chapter? I meant to. So it's the chapter called What is Religion, or What is Religious, depending on the translation of it. And you can feel his anger. But this is why I wanted to note earlier, and please, if you're Lutheran, don't take this in the wrong way, but you can feel he still has a bit of respect for Lutheranism in a way that he doesn't for Catholicism. So the way he describes it is this, and I do want you guys to know this is something that I think could show up on a test, But the way he describes it is this: Catholicism is pure Christianity. So when he says Christianity, he means Catholicism. That's what he's talking about. The reason that he's still a little bit, but barely, sympathetic to Lutheranism is because Lutheranism still has a kind of pagan element to it. And I know that's kind of ironic because generally the Protestant charge against Catholicism is that it's still too pagan. But Nietzsche makes the opposite argument. And the reason is this, and a term, you guys, please write this down. This is the essence of Nietzschean philosophy. Nietzsche says what we all are striving for as individuals, to be greater than other individuals, is what he calls a will to power. It is a will to power. And that's why we don't care about good and evil. All that matters is power. And the individual wills himself. And so why does he hate Catholicism so much? Because Catholicism gives up the will and accepts God's grace. Whereas Luther still had a bit of that Germanic will in him, that old paganism. And so Luther said, we are in bondage to the will, but we don't get rid of it. That's Nietzsche's argument. And that's why Lutheranism is a little bit better than Catholicism, because it still holds on to pagan willpower, whereas Catholicism has gotten rid of it. And again, I know that's an inversion of typical arguments, but that's Nietzsche's claim. So Lutheranism still has a bit of Thor and Odin in it, and that's good for him. He likes that. He thinks that's great. Okay, so here's what he says, and I want to, this is one of the most famous passages. So if you guys have the reading, I'm giving you a slightly different translation, but it's the last two paragraphs of what I gave you. But you guys have a slightly different translation than what I have. But here's what he says, and again, he's hilarious, but when you kind of step back, you realize I shouldn't have been laughing at that, right? That's the kind of humor he has here. Suppose we contemplate the oddly painful and equally crude and subtle comedy of European Christianity with the mocking and aloof eyes of an Epicurean god. Would you guys get the humor in this? Do you remember Epicureanism from your freshman year, Western Heritage?
Which page is this on?
This is the last two paragraphs of what I gave you, and your translation's different. So turn to the very end there, in that. Okay, you guys, do you get the humor in this? It's a brutal humor. But why would it be ridiculous to have an Epicurean god? You guys remember it all, Epicureanism?
I mean, Epicureanism is like avoid pain, seek pleasure.
Yeah. Remember Epicureanism? Epicureanism says we are all atoms, and by pure chance, not by divine will, by pure chance we come together as human beings. And so in Epicureanism, it's not a bad philosophy like hedonism or cynicism. Epicureanism basically says, all right, you're an individual, Hugh's an individual, he should celebrate that because it's a chance coming together of atoms that made him. So what do we do with life? Well, we thank the universe. No God. There's no God. But we thank the universe. We say, for whatever reason, the universe decided I would be a person. And so I've got a good, 80 years. I should celebrate that. I should go out and have a really good bottle of wine. I shouldn't get drunk. That would be stupid. Because if I get drunk, I get sick. But if I have a glass or two of wine, I'm celebrating life. That's really good. And so it's not hedonism. You don't go out and smoke pot. You don't get drunk. It's celebrating. So, I'm going to have a good steak tonight. Just going to make it just like I like it. Not eat too much, just a little bit, but I'm thanking the universe for it. So that's Epicureanism. It's an individualism, but it's a celebration without excess. And so you can think about, an Epicurean, you may not get to heaven, but you're going to be a distinguished person An Epicurean's a good person. An Epicurean is someone who minds their manners, they treat each other well, and they live the good life. They know what good wine is. They know what a good steak is. So that's what he's getting at here. Let's imagine that we're an Epicurean. So, of course, when we look at the eyes of an Epicurean God, Nietzsche's making a joke. There are no gods in Epicureanism. Right? We're just a chance coming together of atoms. But let's say that we were an Epicurean God, an impossibility. I think our amazement and laughter would never end. Doesn't it seem that a single will, there's that word again for Nietzsche, a single will has dominated Europe for 18 centuries. And what has it done? It has turned man into a sublime abortion. A beautiful wreck, a beautiful deconstructed being. Anyone, however, who has approached this almost deliberate degeneration and atrophy of man, represented by the Christian European, Pascal, as the great example, right? Pascal's wager. I may not know God is real, but I'm going to go ahead and assume he is, because when I die, I'm going to take my chances on God rather than not God. Right? Nietzsche just mocks this. You fool. Giving yourself over to an invisibility? How ridiculous. And what is the will Nietzsche's talking about? He's talking about Catholicism. Catholicism has made us less than human. It's diminished us. Feeling the opposite kind of desire. Now, let us not think of the Epicurean spirit, but rather judge with a divine hammer in our hand. Okay, he's just switched completely. What pantheon has the divine hammer? We're no longer Epicureans. What are we?
Norse.
We're Norse, right? We're with Thor. And remember, Thor's a good god. He's not an evil god. He's a good god. Thor believes in justice, still a total pagan, but he's a good god. He wants justice. And so now we're Thor. And what would we say? We would look at horror at the Catholic. We would look with wrath and in pity and in horror. And we would say, oh, you dolts, you presumptuous, pitying dolts, what have you done? What work have you made of my hands? Have you bungled and botched this beautiful stone? What presumption on your part. So, those old Norse gods, they may have been wrong, but they had something better than Christianity. They wanted us to be strong. They wanted us to be fierce. They didn't want us to get up on a cross and submit to the will of the universe. They want us to be powerful. I meant to say Christianity has been the most calamitous kind of arrogance yet. Men not high or hard enough to have any right to try to form man as artists. Men not strong and far-sighted enough to let the foreground law of 1,000-fold failures and ruin prevail, though it cost them sublime self-conquest. Men not noble enough to see the abysmally different order of rank, the chasm of rank between man and man. Such men have so far held sway over the fate of Europe with their supposed equality before God, until finally a smaller, almost ridiculous type, a herd animal. Think about that. Think about the gospel. We are to be like sheep. We are to be like lambs. Nietzsche is repulsed by this. He wants us to be the lion. He wants us to be the bear, not the sheep, not the lamb. That's not what we're meant to do. We are meant to be gods, not meant to be sacrificial animals to the slaughter. And what are we? We are that sickly, eager to please, mediocre creature. We are the Christian of today. So that's Nietzsche. What has Judaism and Christianity done it has put shackle upon shackle upon shackle upon all of us. It has not made us glorious. It has made us a sacrificial animal. And so what are we? We are sickly. We are mediocre. We are tapioca pudding. We're nothing else. And so Nietzsche is rebelling against this in every way. Throw off the shackles. Every time your mother told you to be good, throw that off. That was a rule to make you less than what you are. You are meant to be gods. That's what you are here for. And so, again, let me ask, and I know it's long, but has anybody in here ever listened to Wagner? Have you ever listened to The Ring? Who is the hero of The Ring? The hero is Siegfried. And what does he do? He starts a fire that is so great that he destroys heaven. Because the gods have held us back. And now we are the new gods. We are the new gods. And we will go forth and we will storm heaven. We will have destroyed the old gods. We are the new gods. Siegfried is our leader. What is Hitler listening to when he commits suicide? He is in his bunker. He is listening to The Ring by Wagner. He is going to Valhalla. Ha! Not at all, of course, but that's what he thinks, right? That's Nietzscheanism right there, the essence of it. We shall be as gods. Where have we heard that before?
The Avengers.
Say that again?
The Avengers.
Oh, I wasn't thinking that. I'm thinking of Satan's temptation in the garden. Eat of the apple. Ye shall be as a god. Right? Nietzsche is demonic. He's demonic. He's brilliant, but he's demonic. And that all he's doing is telling us the oldest story in existence. Ye shall be as gods, right? I mean, and that's amazing to think about that. And you're right, it does come through in our comic book heroes, but there it is, right? It's just pure Nietzscheanism. So do you guys recognize, again, you don't have to agree with me in all of this, but I want you to see why the 19th century, it's just so crazy. From any perspective of Western civilization, what do? We always teach it. Here's Socrates. Here's Cicero. Here's Jesus. Here's St. Augustine. Here's Perpetua. Here's Felicity. Here is Thomas Aquinas. Here's Calvin. Here's Luther. Here's Sir Thomas More. Here's Edmund Burke. We have this whole line of people who are talking to each other. And then we get to this century. And it's just a blip in Western civilization. What do you do with Darwin and Marx and Spencer and Freud and Nietzsche? They're like these guys who have all come out of the Western tradition and say, we want nothing to do with that tradition. Nothing at all. May Socrates roll in his grave. What we want is to take man and make him something glorious. Whereas all of the Western tradition says, man, be constrained by good. Recognize that you are fallible. Recognize that you are limited. Recognize that only sacrifice matters. And these guys come along and say, nope, it's exactly the opposite. The last thing you ever want to do is sacrifice yourself for somebody else. You should take your place among the gods. And so, should we be surprised that we get to the 20th century? And what is it? It is the century of the Holocaust. It is the century of the Gulag. It is the century of the killing fields. Why? Because we've taken Mars and Leviathan, those utterly false gods, and we've taken Demos, another utterly false god, and we made sacrifices to them. And we did that over and over and over again. And it didn't matter if you were Jewish or if you were black or if you were Catholic or if you were Lutheran. We just kept sacrificing to these gods. And they had the last laugh in every way. And that's, again, when we think about these guys that we're going to be talking about this semester, when we think about these people like Jacques Maritain or Etienne Gilson or Russell Kirk or J.R.R. Tolkien or C.S. Lewis, they are, or Willa Cather, they are doing everything possible, everything, to get us back to right reason and to say, quit pretending you're divine. Every time you pretend you're divine, it ends in mass slaughter. Don't do that at all. And they're incredible, absolutely incredible. But again, I want you guys to see that. Nietzsche gets it right. He's dead wrong, but he gets it right. He finally calls a spade a spade. He says, let's just admit what we're doing. We're destroying the old gods and we're becoming gods ourselves. And that's why he's so brilliant, utterly evil, but so brilliant. Okay, you guys have any questions about that? I wanted to get to the good guys. Actually, I brought in one of my favorite, we'll spend a few minutes on it because we've got a few minutes left. But do you guys have any questions on this? And do you see what I wanted to get at? Why modernity is like nothing we've ever seen before. And this is, very famously, I love this. C.S. Lewis, he's elected to a chair at Cambridge. And that's glorious in and of itself. Because when Lewis is at Oxford, Lewis is basically, he has the position of what we would call a visiting assistant professor. He's not tenured. He just year-by-year contract. Right? And that, for a genius like Lewis, that had to have been so painful, that his own college doesn't recognize that they've got like the most brilliant guy of the century, right? They just keep using him over and over again, which is crazy. And so finally, Cambridge, through Tolkien, Lewis, I don't think ever knew this, but Tolkien arranged it for Lewis to get this utterly prestigious chair at Cambridge. And so he gets it, 1954. So he goes from being like a visiting professor to having the highest chair at the greatest university. And he gives this speech. And in this speech, he says, I get really frustrated when people say we're returning to paganism. Wouldn't it be kind of fascinating if we took a cow and sacrificed it in front of Parliament? I'd like to have the old pagans. They actually believed in something. The problem with modern liberals, they don't believe in anything at all. Give me a pagan any day over a modern liberal. A pagan believed in something. And so even if they believed in Odin, at least I could argue with them. I could say, well, no, here's Jesus. And Jesus is cooler than Odin. This is why, right? And there's something brilliant about that. And I think that's so telling for us that we imagine that and what that means. But here's the other thing. So we've talked about modernity. We've talked about ideology. Now we've talked about philosophy. Let me just mention one final, I would call it an evil. A lot of people who believe in it are very well intentioned, and I don't think they're evil. I think they're completely mistaken. But the final thing I want to talk about before we really get to the good guys is progressivism and what progressivism is. And I can do it in 5 minutes because it's actually a really simple philosophy. I think it's just dead wrong in every way, but it's a really simple philosophy. Paganism comes from two German thinkers, both probably what we would consider more right-wing than left-wing if we had to use those categories. One is Hegel, and the other is a guy named Fichte. And what they presume, what they believe, is that all of history, and they give history a kind of godlike power, but all of history has purpose. History is an unveiling of truth. Now, as Christians, we would say history is very powerful. God uses history. He used the Jews. Jesus comes in the fullness of time, and we know the apocalypse will be a historical event. But we don't confuse God with history. We recognize history as a vehicle that God can use. But what Hegel and Fichte say is that all of history comes down to this, and this is truly how they present it. This is what progressivism is. Progressivism is all about what is the present moment. That's our laws, our customs, our economics, everything put together. It's our present moment. And they call this, and it makes it easy for the argument, they call this the thesis. The same kind of thing that I want you guys to think about when you're writing a paper for me. You have a thesis statement. What is your paper about? That's the same term they use for the present system. On the other side, they say there is always opposition to that thesis. They convincingly call this the antithesis, the antithesis, the antithesis. And what happens in history is that the thesis collides with the antithesis, the antithesis. Neither side will ever win, and so they create a third thing called the synthesis. That synthesis then becomes the new thesis, and it will be challenged by a new antithesis. And that's history. That's what history is. History is this never-ending cycle of thesis versus antithesis, creation of a synthesis, which becomes the thesis, and then it has a new antithesis. And it just keeps doing this. And that's why someone like J.R.R. Tolkien, who's a deeply anti-progressive man, will say, well, when does it ever end? We're just trapped in cycles. And of course, notice what progressivism does. It never allows for God's grace. God's grace is the absolute, ultimate, non-progressive moment because it takes us out of history. So progressivism, by its very nature, is anti-Christian. But I want you to recognize this about it as well. Progressivism also is deeply simplistic. Notice what it does. It makes history about conflict. And so notice, what do we say in all of progressive history? History is always about conflict. Well, I would totally throw that on its head, and I would say this. What is history? Yeah, history is about the rise of Napoleon. I get that. History is the age of Reagan. I get that. I understand that. But history is also when your mom said, I'm not going to take that 40-hour-a-week job because I want to raise my child. That's history. Nobody records it. But you guys are all here because your mom, who's probably as intelligent, if not more so than your dad, gave up a position, so she sacrifices herself so that you can be here. That's incredible. That's history. History is a series of quiet moments of sacrifice everywhere. That's sorry, I'm thinking about my own mom. But that's what matters. Yeah, it matters that Napoleon arose, but that didn't have a day-to-day influence on you. You're sitting here because your parents sacrificed. My grandfather, my mom's dad, the most dignified man I ever met. During the Depression, he would get in his car with my grandma and they would go pick beets in Colorado. They would follow the migrant train and pick vegetables for 4 months, living out of the back seat of their car. That's incredible. I couldn't do that, but I wouldn't be here without that in any way. And that, to me, that's history. History is, there's just series of unspoken, sorry, I didn't mean to get emotional, but it's just a series of unspoken sacrifices. So how would you ever account for that in a progressive vision of history? History for a progressive would be your mom and dad fighting. That would be a progressive vision of history, right? The thesis, the antithesis, and you're the result. You're the synthesis. Well, how dry, how boring, how devoid of romance is that? Oh, history is falling in love. History is just dying to be with the other person. That's what history is. It's love. So that's what I want us to think about this semester, and we'll keep talking about that, but keep that in mind. Okay, you guys have any, sorry I got emotional, but you guys have any final comments or thoughts? Okay, I do want you guys to bring The Ballad of the White Horse on Thursday, okay? And I hope you're reading Nisbet. We'll get to that as well. But bring Ballad of the White Horse, and I would like someone to volunteer to read on that first day from that. And then I'll have a schedule for us to read throughout the rest of the semester. So, okay, thanks guys very much. Good questions, good thoughts. Thanks for letting me bloviate.